Hey guys, I'm going to do a little presentation on GDP. This is actually a presentation that I put together for an interview I did some time ago. So, pardon the hat here. But first of all, this is a definition of GDP. It's the final monetary value. So it's important to understand that GDP is it's the monetary value of goods and services produced within a nation's border during usually a year. It could be quarterly, it could be monthly, whatever, but some given period of time. It's not the actual value necessarily, because here we're talking about subjective value and things, but it's in terms of, and usually they would do it in terms of US dollars. And that's important because I have a couple articles on who has the world's biggest GDP, right? And so, is it the US or is it China? It depends on how you measure it. If you measure it by US dollars, then according to how many US dollars they produce at a given year, it's still the US. China is supposed to overtake us eventually. I think maybe 10, 15 years, something like that, not sure when, but if you do it by dollars, it's the US. If you do it by actual things produced, it's China. And the reason is, and I think it explains it pretty well in that article, is that if you look at it, a t-shirt, so a shirt like, well, this, sort of like this, right? So a running t-shirt, you go to Brooks, you go to the Nike shop, you go to wherever, buy a Hoka shirt, whatever, and it's probably $40, but you can go to China and get one of these shirts, maybe $2 or $5 or something, right? So you could probably get 8 of them in China versus 1 in the US. So if I produce one of these shirts in the US, that's $40 of GDP, but if I produce 3 of them in China, that could be, what did I say was say $5, so 3 of them is $15, right? So even though I produce 3 of the same shirt in China, 1 in the US, I've got a much larger GDP in the US because the cost of the product, right? So that leads me to a little joke that Planet Money told. There's 2 guys walking down the street, 2 economists, and they come upon a giant pile of horse manure, and one of the economists A tells economist B, I'll give you $20,000 cash if you eat that. Economist B does a cost-benefit analysis, subjective utility, right? He says, yeah, okay. And he eats it, and he gets the economist A hands him 20 in cash, $1,000. They keep walking, they come upon another giant pile of horse manure. Economist B tells economist A, I'll give you $20,000 if you eat that. Economist B does the same thing, or economist A does the same thing, and he said, okay. So he bends over, he eats it. Economist B gives economist A $20,000 in cash. Now think about what happened here, right? And they keep walking, and one of them looks at the other and says, boy, you know what? I'm starting to think we didn't actually do anything. The only thing that happened is nobody's richer. All we did was eat 2 giant piles of horse manure. And that's when the other economist looks at him and says, but you know, GDP did go up by $40,000, right? And so GDP is, and I kind of get into it here, I think, not a great measurement. It's not meant to be a measurement of how well, of happiness, whatever. Those are all subjective things. Here it's just looking at, and real GDP is inflation adjusted. So again, nominal GDP could be the fact that you have Venezuelan boulevards or something, you know, your economy's going crazy. Hey, everybody's so much richer, so well off because they all have, you know, thousands of fold more boulevards, but they buy millions of % less, so times less. So here you go. So that's the basic definition. All right. Whoops. There we go. Wrong button. Lefty, righty. Right. So in this, still kind of sick. Not sick, but I still have stuff left from being sick. So we've got, I'm going to talk about the invention of the idea, where it comes from, what is GDP, kind of the basic Keynesian view, and also talk about some of the other views a little bit. Does it matter? Well, I kind of talked about that a little bit. Is it useful? Get into that. What is not in GDP, and that's important. And does it matter? So by the way, I mentioned it's the reported value of things produced within a nation's borders. I think it was Greece. I read that there was in the textbook, it was about 10 years ago. It goes back to Greece from, I think it was Greece, and they had a large black market. In fact, I was in Constanta Square, I think Constitution Square in Athens in 2007. And I remember watching, there were a lot of usually African immigrants, and they had big blankets of purses and things, and they would work in a really well-coordinated system going. They have kind of the walkie-talkie phones, and they would look around, they kind of wander around the big blanket full of stuff over their shoulder, grab the four corners, right? They would look around, know everything's good, they'd set down, hey, you wanna buy a purse, the Louis Vuitton purse for $20, right? And I don't know how much they were, but obviously knockoffs. And certain areas of New York, you can do that too. I bought DVDs of movies that were still in the theater in Chinatown in New York with my dad, GF. So what he did, he would lay them out, and I remember watching two policemen, and they were about a half a block away, and they were walking towards him, and they're looking at him, and they were walking about this, and they're just talking, and they're walking like this, like this, like this, and finally, when they got really close to the guy, he saw him, and he goes up, he grabs the four corners of the blanket, throws them over his shoulder, and walks away. He was probably 10 feet away from these guys. And the reason is they encourage that kind of activity, because if you don't have these black markets, you want to crack down on this kind of stuff, you have relatively poor countries with poor people, then you're going to increase your government budget because they can't sell stuff, then you're just going to have to give them money to live, and it's very hard on the economy. So there are certain things where they encourage these black market activities. But then when they joined the Union, the EU, well, gotta cut down on that stuff. So, anyways, hit the right button here. So this is kind of he credits the invention of gross domestic product, which I don't know if I even said what it was, but that's what GDP is. And so this was, I think, on Planet Money, yeah. And it talked originally national income, and they were kind of clear perception there was something really bad going on in the 30s, but they didn't know how to measure it. We see people in lines at soup kitchens, but how do we know what's really going on? And so they came up with this idea. They would calculate the total amount of goods and services produced within the nation. Then you can compare, given numbers, 3 is greater than 2. Therefore, if you produce 3 in 1 year and 2 the year before, you've increased production by 50%. Of course, you have to adjust for inflation, but that's why GDP is actually useful in many ways. Robert F. Kennedy, I think it was, gave a famous speech on more of a wellness index or something, how GDP actually, and I'll get into that later. So this is the basic kind of very simplistic Keynesian view of what's going on here. And what you have is you have the product market where you have the money. Actually, we should start here. So what happens first is you have households and you have businesses. Households sell their usually labor, but if they own land, they could rent it out. If they have capital like a truck or something, or they could loan actual, what we think of capital in terms of money. They could loan it to a business, and in return, they get money, right? They get interest, land to rent, labor to wages. So they take what they have and they loan it to the business, or they sell it. The business gives them money. This is the factor market, so the factors of production, right? Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And they take that money and they give it to the business, total value, monetary value of goods and services produced. So, which these are equal, these should be equal. They should all be equal, basically, sort of. That's kind of an assumption there. But we get into something called leakages. That is, if you decide to save money, you don't spend all your money, you save it. Well, that's a leakage, but what that does is it goes into capital, which eventually goes to business. That's an injection. So leakages are when you sell something to the business, they give you money, give you $100, and you only spend 50 of it, giving it back to the business, and then they give you $50 worth of goods and services. What happens to the other $50? So, $100 changed hands here, 50 here, where it's an imbalance. So what you have is that $50 goes back to the business just in a different way. That's called leakage. It's injected back through investment. So very, very little. You have a rounding error of money that you'll keep, and you'll keep it in your wallet. Like, I don't have my wallet on me, but I'm sure you guys have a couple dollars in cash with you. So this is the basics, very simplistic. So this is the Keynesian view, and it's kind of more market-based. It's a little bit different, a little more complex. This is what you would see from the air, but if you want to go down into the factory and see what's going on, you've got this entrepreneurial activity, you've got people supplying what they have, the goods. Say's law says goods buy goods, so you trade your labor for goods and services and things. We'll kind of get into that in a separate chapter, but very, very basic outline here of what the circular flow of income and product is. Okay. So again, you trade what you have for money, then you send that money back to the business in return for goods and services. And then you do it again. You go back to work, you get money, you go back to the store, you get stuff, go back to work, get money, right? So just repeat this many, many times. All right, how many times do you rinse, repeat? Once. We'll just repeat this more than that. There we go. Question, answer, right? Every transaction simultaneously has an expenditure and a business receipt. So for every good that's supplied, there is a demand. And I think you could take this to Say's law. Every time that in order to demand a good, you must first supply that good into the market, or some good into the market that's desired. So every good that's supplied into the market is demanded by somebody else who's supplying something into the market and would like to trade that. So trading goods for goods. And so you have this fairly well balanced system going on. So, again, we've got the definition here. It's within a nation's borders, they do have gross national income, which is U.S. citizens. That includes that's everything that U.S. citizens produce. Subtract off, if you have immigrants in the country who are not citizens, and they're, like, if somebody comes from either Mexico or Canada and they come to work in the U.S., their production would be counted by Canada or Mexico. And Americans working in Canada or working in Europe or working in South America or whatever, those would be counted. That's not GDP though. So, and again, final goods and services. These are goods and services in their final stage. So, you go to the store and you buy wheat. If you're going to take that wheat and bake bread with it and then sell that bread, the wheat would not be counted as a final good and service, right? Because you don't want to count it then you sell the bread, you count it again, you're double counting, right? So what you want to do is that's why if you go to Costco and you have a business account, you don't pay sales tax on the stuff you buy. You take it home, you take it to your business, and you sell it there, and then you pay sales tax on that, and that is counted as a final good and service. But if you're buying a 20 pack of gum at Costco, then you're taking it to your little market or whatever, and you're going to sell it there as individual packs, then you're going to count the final sale. You don't count the 20 packs at Costco as part of GDP and then count them again. So that's a more detailed look at how things work in the economy, right? But not what we're looking at here. So, and here's some more examples. So you've got the wheat. Now, if you take it home and you just bake it, you buy it at Fred Meyer or whatever, and you bake it, then that is a final good and service. You consume it, right? You're consuming it. If you bake it and you sell it to your neighbor and you don't tell anybody about it, it's not taxed. It's still going to be counted as a final good and service. It has to be counted somewhere along the line, but only once, right? Steel, crude oil, these are things that are produced. These are factors, or these are resources, right? And so they are turned into final goods and services that are counted, right? Steel turned into auto or whatever. Bread is turned in, or no, it's not. Oil is turned into gasoline, and when you buy it at the station, it's counted, but the oil itself is not counted. the work done to pull the oil out of the ground, that would be counted as a final good and service, right? Or that would be counted in GDP. It's kind of like a service, maybe. But so again, the simplistic view of it, how do you calculate it? Well, you look at consumption. That is the amount of goods consumed by private individuals. Investment, so the amount of business investment that goes into so the difference would be if you go to Home Depot and you want to fix up your kitchen and you buy some wood and stuff and you fix up your kitchen, that's consumption. But if you go to Home Depot and you want to build, or let's say you want to build an extra room on your house so you can have that third kid, right, or something like that, then when I was growing up, they turned the garage into a room, and that way, rent out the basement, whatever, and we had enough rooms for all of us, and so that was consumption. But had he done that and he was going to rent out the room as like a business, that would have been considered investment. He could have written it off as part of his business, right? But so if you're adding a room onto your house, consumption. If you're adding a room onto a hotel, it's investment, right? It's the same thing, but it's counted differently because it's for a different purpose. So that's kind of investment. Then you have government expenditures. The government goes out and buys hammers at $200 a piece, $100,000 toilets, things like that. Normal everyday things that the government buys, right? And then you have net exports. So you add these three things and then you subtract, because the US has like $1 trillion trade deficit, right? So you subtract that off. So in general, in our Keynesian economics, which again we get into in a few weeks, consumption is very heavily focused on, that's demand. So that's about 70% of the economy. Investments maybe 10, government's like 25 or 30. And now you're saying, 70, 10, 100, 110, yeah, exactly, minus 10%, right? So 70, 80, 110, 100, right? Because we import a lot more than we export. So it doesn't matter. Again, I kind of talked about putting numbers to the economy. You want to see, has our economy increased in growth? What's happened over this period of time, right? Just check to make sure it's still recording. I got it with me. Totally screwed me in on the last one. Switched over to slow-mo. So, that was a different unit though. Okay, so we've got recessions and depressions. They are defined by GDP. A recession is when your neighbor loses a job. A depression is when you lose a job. It's an old joke. A recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP or negative economic growth. And depression is just a very long, dirty, awful recession. Now, was 2008 a recession or a depression? Well, it's been called the Great Recession. Don't know. Well, I guess it wasn't as bad as the Depression, but there were a lot of reasons for that. Is one of them because the government saved the world? No. But there was a lot of intervention. Maybe it wasn't as bad, but that's a whole other, we'll get into that again. The Great Depression was caused by Hoover interventions in the markets, but that's for the next chapter. Couple away. Economic strength of a country can now be, easily calculated, quote unquote. So we can compare economies, right? I mean, how do you compare? You measure, right? You pull out a measuring. You take whatever you're comparing, you pull out a measuring stick, and you have a little contest. Right? And so the measuring stick is US dollars, or the goods and services in terms of US dollars. So now GDP itself, all by itself, doesn't matter. Hey, the GDP of India is much greater than the GDP of Denmark. Where would you rather live? Everybody says Denmark, right? Of course. And the reason is Denmark has a tiny fraction of the number of people. So GDP per capita is what really matters. And so you want your GDP to grow at a greater percent than your population, right? If your GDP grows by 2% and your population grows by 10%, you're actually worse off. right? Because you have a negative GDP per capita growth, right? So you're actually shrinking in terms of dollars per person. Now, the dollars per person, it's not really a fair comparison because I think Luxembourg has the highest, because, hey, Luxembourg is where all the super rich live, right? It's not like, and it's a little tiny country, I think maybe 50, 100,000 people, something like that, a little tiny country. Yeah, the Vatican, I think one person technically lives in the Vatican, maybe, I don't know. But these are countries with high GDP per capita, but they're not really, it's not a fair comparison. The US has still the highest GDP per capita, I believe, and China has the biggest GDP in terms of things produced, but you know, if you're the average Chinese citizen is not real well off, right? So I've been there a few times. There's a lot of poverty. You don't see anything like that in the United States. You don't really, in fact, you don't see poverty in the US, to be frank. Right? Not when you think about what poverty really is in the world. There's nothing like that in the US, obviously. Nobody goes hungry on accident, right? Had arguments about that with people online. Hey, guess what? You know, great place to spend your weekend. Arguing online. But that was a long time ago. But what I'm saying there is that there's so much food in this country, there's so much wealth in this country, and people are so willing to give it to others on an individual basis. Like if you go outside the US, it's much better understanding. I've been to places in the US, I've been to Morgan City and down, I canvassed down in kind of, well, Houma was the main area, but Thibodeau and some of the places in Louisiana, and up the bayou, some pretty poor areas down there too. Not like around here. I mean, actual poverty in the US, but not compared to the world. So, side note there. But the value of homemaker services, so this is what's not counted. Again, I talked about black markets. That country, Greece, had a large black market that accounted for, according to the little thing in the textbook, I think was like 40% of their economy. It's not official. And so, but they knew it was there and they can estimate how big it is. It's kind of like they have drug estimates. Well, how can you know how much drug costs if it's illegal? Well, they have their ways of calculating, right? And so you can calculate how much black market activity exists. And so they figured it's about 40%. And so they were getting money from the IMF, the World Bank, and then they started counting their black market in their GDP, and they were no longer considered a poor country, and all those free money from the IMF stopped, right? Now, why would they do that? Well, I think it was something to do with probably wanting to get into the EU, right? The EU doesn't want officially poor countries, so if you're trying to get into the EU, what Greece did is they were trying to sell themselves, and that's why Greece went bankrupt, is because they lied about how well off they were. Goldman Sachs helped them cover a lot of the debt, hide a lot of the debt through credit default swaps and things like that. And then once they got into the EU, they're like, hey, we're in now, let's show our warts, right? So the old stories kind of wearing a veil until the end of the wedding, and then you pull your veil off, and it's just like Jacob and Rachel, right? Some of you know what I'm talking about. You get the wrong wife. So his father-in-law worked for, so there's an old story, it's an Old Testament story. It's Jacob and Leah, I think. He wanted Rachel, so he agreed to work for 7 years. And then on the wedding night, the relations, and after that's over, she pulls her veil off, and it turns out it's Leah, the oldest daughter of, what's his name? And so he's, of course, super angry. You lied to me, you gave me the wrong vote, I didn't want her, I wanted the other. So think about how that's gonna work. And then, of course, he said, okay, well, don't worry, I'll give you work for me another 7 years, I'll give you Rachel. And so he works another 7 years for Laban. And after 4, so again, that's just the idea of pulling the veil off. It's like, oh, it's the wrong woman, right? So sidetrack there, doesn't matter. Bartering. So bartering is not counted. There there were calls to count homemaking services, which is kind of ridiculous. Homemaking's great, I'm just saying that I think they counted in GDP. How would you even do that? Like, it's impossible. You can have everybody go out and say how many hours they spend cleaning, self-report. There's no way to really look at it and have an objective measuring stick, right? So, it's just a way that you would inflate your GDP quite a bit. And they do change the way GDP is calculated often. So these are the best bits. I kind of implied this. You know, bad things raise GDP. So that speech I mentioned, he talked about crime, prisons, destruction. Did you ever get your house broken into? When I was in high school, we did, and yay, house is broken into. We were going to do a lot of good work for GDP, right? So obviously, it's bad. This is a broken window fallacy. That is the idea that war and destruction, or I should say, destroying things will create prosperity. And you can say, well, okay, yes, they'll have to build the building back, but you haven't actually created anything. All you are is poor, right? But the idea is that the broken window fallacy, if I picked up a chair and I throw it through the window, 2 jobs you created, right? They fire me and they need somebody else. But mainly is broken window. In fact, it's in the Homer Economics book. I think it's the first paragraph or something. And they would have to hire somebody to come out, clean up the glass, fix the window. Could be like $5,000 maybe. And look at that, I've given that glass man a job. He's gonna go and he's gonna be happy and he's gonna buy something at the store for his wife. And you know, everybody's having on down the line. But what they're missing is the school is no different except it's $5,000 poorer. What they could have done is taken that $5,000 and bought a couple computers and made students' lives better with that money. But instead, they just had to fix a window, and that money would have gone to a computer, and then that computer guy's salesman would have taken the money and bought his wife something new, and so broken window fallacy is a problem with that which is seen and that which is unseen. You don't see what the money would have gone to. All you see is that the money goes somewhere. Right? So the broken window fallacy means destruction is actually bad in all times. You have your house broken into, you have to pay a deductible to the insurance company, you go through a lot of headache. The insurance company then has less money. So, more people, more destruction, more crime means insurance premiums go up, everybody pays a higher price. Pollution, well, controlling pollution, I talked about how there's an article in there, 2 of them, I think, 1 or 2, about the EPA's regulation on pollution that actually reduces GDP because of the vast expenditure that companies have to put forth to adjust to or to follow through with the regulation that may or may not have any real benefits. But it does cost you a lot of money, right? You can look at Homer Simpson. One of the episodes, he builds a doghouse, but of course he's really stupid, so he didn't even have a door. It was just a bunch of boards nailed together. I think he nailed his foot to it too, so he actually took wealth and destroyed it, right? So you have good lumber, he turns it into a doghouse that's totally useless. I mentioned some of the other measurements. You can read through the PowerPoints for this chapter and get a lot more on it, but I think that's good. Yeah, so that's kind of a basic introduction to GDP. It's got its ups and downs, right? So there's actually other ways that might be better to measure production and what's actually produced within an economy instead of just $40,000 because 2 guys decided to eat manure, right? And they paid each other the same amount, so no money actually changed hands in the end. So nothing was actually done, but GDP was increased. So that's just an example of how GDP is kind of problematic. So, okay, hope you enjoyed that.